Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got myself, Brad, and Mr. Spencer here. Today we're going to talk about critical vulnerabilities that you don't find using Nessus. And we're going to pick on Nessus a little bit, but they're not the only ones, right? So as always, if you find this information useful, please rate, share, like, all that good stuff. It's really beneficial to us. So, all right, give me the nickel tour, man. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, so this is a interesting topic. We pose every week. We throw out a couple ideas, and we're like, oh yeah, that one is the one we're going to talk about this week. So Nessus is, by the way, just a proxy for Qualys, whatever XYZ vulnerability scanner, right? Nessus is just widely known, and it's kind of clickbaity title, to be honest, right?
Yeah.
So the topic, right? Vulnerability scanning, vulnerability management, right? Why is this an important topic? Why should we care about vulnerabilities that we can't find or don't find with vulnerability scanners? Well, to start, it's important to talk about vulnerability management, right? Vulnerability management is a key component to a strong security program, right? To have a good defensible posture, it's very important to do vulnerability management. And a subcomponent of vulnerability management is scanning for vulnerabilities, right? You probably all do that in your organizations, in your firms. That's all good and dandy. It's part of the blocking and tackling, like you like to say, Brad. And it's something that we talk about pretty much every episode, right? It's part of a layered approach to security. So vulnerability scanning, though, is just one part of vulnerability management, right? You don't just find vulnerabilities by scanning for them. And that's kind of the purpose of this episode. And to kind of dig a little bit deeper on that, vulnerability scanning has its limitations, just like everything else. It has its strengths, weaknesses, and I think a perfect example in my mind when I was thinking about an outline for this episode was a 0-day, right? Vulnerability scanning is dependent upon in a large way on signatures, right? A 0-day is something that is unknown yet, and it's publicly disclosed, and the vendor has no idea that it exists, or maybe they do. That's up for debate, but there's no fix for it, right? It's publicly disclosed, but no fix for it. So there's no signatures for it. So vulnerability scanners traditionally don't find it. So vulnerability scanning, not a panacea, right? It's not a silver bullet. It's one way to identify vulnerabilities, but there are other ways that we're going to talk about in this episode, like pen testing, source code review, red teaming, all these different techniques that you can use to find vulnerabilities that you won't find by vulnerability scanning. So that's kind of the purpose of this episode. That's kind of like a TLDR of what I was thinking we would talk about. And yeah.
And I more common than I feel like it should be when we're talking to clients about their programs, right? And specifically their cybersecurity programs. And we start getting down to the conversation about vulnerabilities, and there is by the way, a huge difference between vulnerability management and vulnerability scanning. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people assume that my vulnerability management program is the thing that I do by scanning every week or month or whatever it is. And then I patch those things every, within 30 to 60 days, depending on, that's cool, man.
Yep.
It's not a vulnerability management program, right? That's a component of a vulnerability management program. And so it does strike me as a surprise that so many folks think that that's all there is to their vulnerability, management program. So, why? Well, I guess first, right? We should define what a vulnerability scanner is.
Yep.
I think we should level set on that, and then talk about why it has the limitations that it does, and how you can close it. So.
Yep. Yeah. So what is vulnerability scanning? How do they work? Right. We alluded to it in kind of the introduction of this episode, but vulnerability scanning, right, is using tools, usually in an automated fashion, to find vulnerabilities, flaws, weaknesses, insecure configurations in software, systems, networks, et cetera, right? So at its core, foundational elements, it's automatically searching for finding flaws in systems, right? Vulnerability scanning typically works by having a database of known vulnerabilities, right? Log4j and, cross-site scripting and all these other types of vulnerabilities that have a known signature, right? And that signature could be a file that exists. It could be a software version. It could be a registry key in the Windows world. It could be a directory that exists or doesn't exist. There's a number of things that could create a signature, right, to be able to identify a vulnerability. And vulnerability scanners just go out in your network or wherever you're pointing it to scan and look for those indicators, look for those signatures to find if that vulnerability is potentially present or not. So if the signature is found, potentially vulnerable, right? And then you have severity ratings based on CVSS scores and things like that that tie into that. But that's basically, right, how vulnerability scanning works and how those are identified. Did I miss anything, Brad, you think?
No, you hit it, man. I want to talk a little bit too about how we configure them, because I think that leads into their limitations. But no, I mean, that's exactly how they work, right? And it's important to understand that, because anytime we're doing what I would probably call a prescriptive analysis, which is something that is very rigid and strict, right? So Nessus, Burp Suite, Enterprise Scanner, all of those things, like you said, they're signature based, meaning that there's a very narrow set of cases where that pops positive, meaning that the vulnerability exists. And if it doesn't fit within those parameters, it doesn't show up. And so that's not always ideal, right? It's probably better than, if you had to choose a single method, that's an acceptable way of doing it. It's just not comprehensive. So
yeah, and something like Nessus, like Burp, stuff like Defect Dojo, stuff like code scanning tools that they're searching for known signatures. And a lot of those commercial tools, they have very big databases, right, of signatures to find these things. But by their very nature, right, they cannot find everything. And the limitations, like you were beginning to talk about, some of the limitations are that one, it has to be known, right? There has to be a known flaw that I can identify some programmatic way, right? So it has to be known. It has to be something that I can scan for through an automated process. And signature-based detections the vulnerability scanning rely on those signatures being up to date. So using the example Log4j, right? Log4j came out and there was no signatures for it, right? It was a 0-day. There's no signatures for it until researchers started discovering it. The vendors started implementing signatures for it, right? And when those new vols are discovered, like I said, there's no signature for it. So those are some of the limitations, some of the drawbacks of using something like that, and why it's important to kind of branch out and use other methods that we'll talk about soon.
Yeah, I agree. And it does ignore, everything about these scanners tend to assume that a signature-based detection is even possible, right? Because in a lot of cases, a vulnerable configuration of an up-to-date application, may not be detectable through this method, right?
Yep.
The joke that I always like to use when we're doing when we're teaching external pen testing, right? And this illustrates your lack of ability to rely on tools, is if you load up a website and there's a big button that says hack this company, click here, right? No scanner anywhere on planet Earth is going to detect that somebody put a self-destruct button on a website. Okay. Now, is that ever going to happen? No. But it illustrates the point that if it did, if there were something that were blatantly obvious to humans, it's not blatantly obvious to a scanner or a tool of some kind. And so it requires some human oversight, right? At least for now, until AI takes over the world. But yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I think is interesting too is it lacks context, right? Take, for example, the SSL TLS vulnerabilities, right? I'm pretty sure that Nessus still categorizes those either high or criticals. If it's like SSL3, I think it's a critical even. I'm not sure. But those those exploits are academic, right? They're theorized. They might have been somewhat have some proof of concepts in some academic sense, but those aren't realistic, right?
I agree.
And vulnerability scanning lacks the context of a human understanding the results, right? Which is where vulnerability management comes in. Is, you take those results, analyze them, kind of boil it down, figure out what's important, and determine what you need to focus on. And if you just rely on vulnerability scanning alone, you're going to be fixing all of those, high and critical vulnerabilities that might not actually be the most critical, right? You and I know, you run an Nessus scan and an informational could be like open telnet. That might be an informational vulnerability, and you might miss it if you just, are looking at highs and criticals. So lacks context. Whereas if you're doing manual inspection, like a manual pen test, or if you're doing manual source code review, you have human eyes and understanding and logic to say, oh, that code looks really weird. I'm going to dig into that and figure out what that does. And that's another interesting part of this, is in part of the limitations of just pure vuln scanning.
Agreed. And that context is really important. I want to go a step further with that, because another great example of context that we see that things like Nessus just don't get. And again, I'm using Nessus as a proxy for all the tools, but is it inside or outside your network, right? Like 3389 open inside your network, don't care. I expect that to be the case, right? Prefer it wouldn't be, but I understand why it is. If I see 3389 on a public IP, we have an entirely different problem. In most cases, that is substantial enough for us to throw a flag on a pen test and start calling people like, hey, dude, you got to fix this right now. Like we're not going to get off the phone until I don't get 3389 out of Nmap anymore. And so Nessus has no idea, man. It's just an open port. Like you said, it actually shows up as, port service found, informational, and it moves on. And so you could have the best vulnerability scanner and vulnerability management program, period. And if you're relying on Nessus to tell you that, risky services are open, you're just going to miss it, man. Yep. And only because, it's a non-routable IP versus a routable IP, which I think that would be easy to implement, right?
Yep.
But anyway, and same thing with like Suite 32, right? Oh no, my printer web interface inside my network has this Suite 32 vulnerability. I don't care, man. Yep. Okay, maybe it's a CVS. I think it's a CVS that's 10 or some. No, it's not 10. It's a 9 or something. But it's crazy high, and it dominates a vulnerability scan. But does it actually create a significant amount of risk for your organization, right? And I think that's another thing too that you need to consider is these scanners, again, no context. So is the severity the scanner is giving you, is it real? Right. Or are they just replaying that same score from what the vendor said that it is? And so you have to be able to look at that with your own eyes and apply your own risk tolerance / technical understanding of your controls to that in order to make it real for your organization. So the deeper you get into objectively reviewing the capability of a vulnerability scanner, the more you realize, man, this thing is a box of bricks. Right? It has no intelligence. Now they're getting better, by the way. Tenable.io has some actual ability to go out and cross-reference dark web with, exploit availability and stuff like that. And we are making improvements. We're not there.
Yep. Yeah. And, we talked about 0 days a little bit, and, I think that's a fairly obvious example. But another thing that is very common to see, especially in the web app pen testing world, that Brad, you're very familiar with, and is logic flaws, like business logic flaws in applications or systems or processes. Even when you start talking about, internal pen tests and red teaming, looking, vulnerability scanning, for example, just taking my own internal pen test knowledge, right? Vulnerability scanning is not going to identify that a IT department uses the same password with like the user's start date on the end of the password, right? As their new user password. But let's say you're on an internal pen test, you find a document that references that standard, right? That's a vulnerability in a process that IT has created. No vulnerability scanner is going to find that,
Yeah.
right? And the same thing is true in the web app world. You have business logic flaws that are certain things need to be chained together in order to produce a vulnerable condition. So that's something that's also interesting in a limitation of scanning, right? Is the logic
Yeah.
flaws, business logic, finding flaws in a design or implementation of a system.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think also I'm going to lump this in with your logic flaw category, or your bit. Sorry, your business logic flaw, however you want to look at that. Is just improper design, right? And what I mean
Yep.
by that is using insecure protocols, using insecure technical processes. So for example, we used to find tons of vulnerabilities in how people were configuring MQ. If you don't know what MQ is, it's basically it's just a task queuing system, right? And it's used a lot in very large organizations that have complex technological ecosystems, and and the way that they would build those those MQ tasks were often very insecure and didn't have a lot of really strong protections inside of it. And so we could drop, for example, you could go all the way to the outside of a banking system and drop a certain command into a chat field somewhere, and then it would work its way through to a log file that got picked up by a task that moved it to a server that read it into another website, and you're 7 layers removed from the external system, and then you pop cross-site scripting on a customer service rep, and we used to find those things all the time. You're never going to get close to that, man. I don't even care how good your SAST or DAST or whatever it is on your web app is, because you're looking at that system out of the context of everything around it. And when I say complex ecosystems, I really mean that. Like in a lot of cases, especially in the application world, there are so many moving parts and so many different technology pieces in that. It's very difficult to take a singular view of an app
Yep.
and figure out what risk it really creates downstream.
Yep. So let's talk about how to find that stuff. So we talked a lot about what vulnerability scanners can't find, they're incapable of finding, they have trouble finding. How do we find those things, right? I have a couple in our notes here
Mhm.
that we can talk about, but how do we find stuff that Nessus or Qualys or Burp Suite or XYZ, vulnerability scanning tool doesn't find, right? First one I'll bring up and we can go from there. Pen testing, right? Our
Yeah.
favorite thing, right?
It's what we do, man.
It's what we do. So obviously we're a little bit biased, but that bias is not incorrect, right? I'll say,
Yeah.
for a lack of a better word, right? Vulnerability scanning exists, pen testing exists for specific reasons. They're different tools in the tool belt, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of manual work involved in pen testing, a lot of manual enumeration and kind of identification and validation that something is vulnerable, right? You take a vulnerability, it says, oh, this looks vulnerable. Maybe it's a version. Now let me see if there's actually a way to exploit that to kind of validate that risk exists, right? Logic flaws is very common in pen testing. So yeah, thoughts on kind of how do we find this stuff, Brad?
So let's talk about pen testing for just a minute, because I think everybody, hopefully, right? What episode are we on? Like 50,
29?
60, 70? I don't know. Yeah. So hopefully if you're following along, you know what pen testing is, right? But there are some limitations even with pen testing. And I don't think anybody on this team or any other pen testing team would make the claim that it's a silver bullet either, right? For a couple of things, and let's break down why. Number one, pen testing is a fixed length engagement. We only have so many days/hours to do the work, right? And there invariably will be things that we don't have time to look at. And so we try to do a good job of being as comprehensive as we can, but that's just reality, especially in your world, right? In internal pen testing, man, if they got 1,200 internal machines, you're not looking at every one of those, right? We're
Yep.
casting a net, pulling it back, grabbing strings, and seeing what makes sense. And so so it's a single point in time, and it is a limited time engagement. So what that means is, out of 365 days, 361 of them, there's not a pen tester in your environment. Okay. So that's important to understand depending on your size, right? And this gets easier the larger you are. But if you can have someone pen test on a regular basis, and what I mean by that is, technology group is building a new set of servers, right? We're deploying a new application, and how are the servers configured? How is the application configured? What are those things doing? Now, it could be really expensive if you're hiring third parties. I would tell you to hire somebody internally to look at those. Have a security engineer, security analyst that has at least some idea of what they're doing with regards to pen testing. They don't have to be an expert pen tester, but at the minimum, they can take a broad view of that and say, hey man, why are we going live with a brand new system that's got telnet open? Like, what's the logic behind that? Walk me through that. And so I guess what I'm saying is, look at these systems before you put them in. The time to find the problems are before the system goes live, because I'll give you a great example. One of the huge problems that we found, we moved buildings at one of the places I used to work, and the HVAC system required some really weird ports to be opened outbound through the firewall. And so, we didn't have an opportunity to review the HVAC system. It existed within, we ended up having to spin off an entirely new network because we didn't trust it, and it's all like, made by people, that we can't talk to. And so had we had an opportunity to review that HVAC system, review its technical requirements, and then do a, pseudo pen test on that environment before it went live, we could have been like, hey, timeout. This is not going to work. Right. That happened a lot in the financial world for us. And we would literally, we would go into the procurement stage, right, where we would want to buy a piece of software. Let's say we want to buy like a mortgage maintenance app. Okay. Before it could be completed through procurement, we had an opportunity to ask their technical staff for documentation. So we did. We got admin documentation. We got all this stuff, support, et cetera. And in some cases, we would even get a demo of it, right? Like even a live demo, whatever. You would be surprised the number of security issues you can find reading the user and the admin manuals of some of these softwares. And so, it's like, oh, you can only configure the database to use a blank SA password. Dude, how about no? And so, so what I'm telling you is this, right? You don't need to spend a pile of cash, but you can have someone that is technical with a mind towards security, do some due diligence on the front end of implementing these to save yourself a tremendous amount of headache, right? Yep. And a lot of those manuals are on the website. So, if you want to, if you're thinking about getting something, go dig through their technical stuff.
That's what we do on pen tests.
That's exactly what we do on pen tests. Yeah. And I will tell you, I like using the word hygiene, because if someone is using JavaScript to provide input validation on a website, that is going to tell you something about their knowledge and their ability to implement proper security in a website. And we can take that knowledge and say, hey, I bet if they're not doing that, they're definitely not doing this other thing. And so, you start to get a feel for it. And you can get that without a pen test or a vulnerability scan for that matter. You get that just from looking at their website.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good point. And you bring up a good point that all of these things are not things that, like you said, you don't need to hire out for these things. You can develop these things internally. You can develop these processes internally. You can hire people. You can have some people in IT work on these things if you have a small team. So yes, what we're saying is, you don't have to run out and hire a Secure IT 360, although we'd love you to, but these are things you can develop yourselves and should look at developing yourselves for cost reasons and just for scalability, right? To be able to do this on a continuous basis is really important. And you're not going to do that by just hiring somebody out once a year to find these things.
Sure. And don't be afraid to put the shit in the contract, dude. Right. So like when you're signing agreements with an organization, put in there that you require them to get their product pen tested annually by an independent third party. Put in there that you want to be able to exit the contract if their software is deemed to be insecure based on industry standards. There are a lot of things you can do that are not super technical to protect yourself.
Yeah. And a lot of people, forget, are not thinking this way, but when you're buying a product, that company wants your money, right? Like they want to sell you something and they want to take your money. So
Yep.
you have full reign, uh, you know, to negotiate the terms of that contract with them. A lot of times organizations will work with you, vendors will work with you to figure out some sort of agreeable, amicable agreement that makes sense for everyone.
Agreed.
And their blanket contracts are what their legal team have designed to fully protect that organization, right? From all risks. So definitely negotiate those things.
So many side quests we went on right there, by the way.
It's good though. It's good though. Like it's all relevant to the discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
And we skipped over a little bit on red teaming, but that I think falls a lot into pen testing. That example, what I said earlier, is kind of into that red teaming example, right? Red teaming is more about testing blue team's response than it is about finding all of the vulnerabilities. So again, very distinct and unique in that with a red team, you're not looking for every single vulnerability you can find within the time frame. You're looking to accomplish a business objective, a business goal that has been set forth by you in the firm, right? You being the red team company or organization and the firm to achieve some objective, right? To show some risk somewhere in some process. So it's very process driven type of exercise engagement. And it's not purely technical, right?
Yeah.
It's not purely technical. You're in contracts and negotiating these things. Like vulnerabilities are not purely technical things. Their process, their business workflows, all things that are not strictly technical.
Agreed. And I really like red teaming for being very prescriptive about a particular system or series of systems that work together. One of the things that we usually end up looking at from a red teaming perspective is endpoint security, alerting, and defense capabilities. That is deceptively complex. The amount of moving parts on a PC with regards to all the security controls that exist and all of the softwares that are running there and the different things that are going on is extremely complex. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say a complex ecosystem, because you can't look at just DFE and its capabilities and make a determination of how secure that endpoint is, because there's 7 other things or maybe 70 other things that are involved in how secure that endpoint is, including things like GPOs. And all of that is awesome unless you leave the domain admin password in a text file on the C drive. None of that matters anymore, and no scanner's ever going to find that, and so, you could do all the fanciest endpoint stuff you want. And if that self-destruct button is on your website, it doesn't matter.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And one of the examples I like to use too, to discuss this is, and to illustrate this point, is things like a task, right? Scheduled task running on an app server that does something, right? So it does some daily task, maybe it does, generates a daily report or something. Well, that report is being run or executed from a batch file. That batch file is located on a file share where everybody has access to read, write, and execute, right? Now you've taken something that is, by nature, fairly secure. You're running a task on a server. It's isolated. It's got its own credentials, whatever. Now you're taking that and expanding it out to a file system or file share that's accessible by everybody, and you allow users to write to that file. Now I can modify things, and I can, in the CVSS world, I'm escaping the context of that specific scope, right? I'm now expanding the scope of that vulnerable system, that network, to include other things. So those can be very hidden, very dangerous, right? And again, not going to find those through scanning.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
So source code, we didn't really talk a lot about source code review, but this is something, that is very effective, right? I remember Darius talking about previous engagements where he would do, analysis, source code review and analysis, and finding very impactful vulnerabilities very easily and quickly. that just are not discoverable by scanning for the reasons we just talked about, right? They're kind of logic flaws. They're intricacies with the code. There's complex data structures that need to be analyzed to figure these things out. But a skilled programmer or a developer who has that security background can identify those things when they're looking at it. So source code review, and analyzing that is another good way. We didn't touch on too much, but in a very important way, especially if you're developing your own software.
Agreed. Yeah, and it's really big because, well, I'll put it a different way, right? There's a reason that fuzzing is one of the most common ways for folks to enumerate and identify vulnerabilities in software, right? But why are we fuzzing? Well, we're fuzzing because we probably don't have access to source code, and we're trying to put as many unknowns into that application as we can, so it's going to behave in an unexpected manner. I can skip all that, man, if I can just go open the source of that application and follow it on my screen. And I can find stuff more effectively, more efficiently, and eliminate false positives almost to zero.
Yep.
Because we can look downstream on that code flow and determine if maybe there's a mitigating control at a later time. So I agree, man. Probably the most effective. Also, it's a little bit of a lift. It's not an easy thing. It requires a certain skill set. But like you said, if you live in the world of writing code, you better have somebody looking at that.
Yep, for sure. Cool.
It's good stuff, man. I love it. And we could probably talk for another hour on this. But hopefully we've gotten the point across, to the listeners that, like, hey man, don't rely on that vulnerability scanner to protect you, because it's going to do a pretty good job. Like, there's a reason that everybody does vulnerability scanning. We're not telling you don't do it. We're just telling you that that's not the end all be all, to protect your environment and establish a solid cybersecurity program. It is one cog in the machine.
Yep.
So good stuff, man. So listen, folks, that's all the time we have for you today. If you liked everything that you saw, or even something that you saw, share, rate, like, all that good stuff. And we will see you next Wednesday.